I'm definitely no figure painter, and rarely, if ever, do I put a figure in my aircraft models. But after getting a few requests to show how I would paint a pilot figure, I thought I'd give it a try on my 1/32nd Hasegawa Raiden build. Hopefully, you all will cut me a little slack, as I'm still trying to get the hang of the best techniques to use to paint a realistic figure. But here's the result of one of my early attempts. In this video, I'll walk through the steps I used. The first step was to assemble the pilot. Hasegawa provides several different heads as well as different arm poses, so you can choose the one you like the best. I decided to pose mine saluting prior to taking off for another mission. I assembled the main parts of the cockpit so I could use them to make sure my pilot was posed properly. I kept adjusting the arms until I had the pilot saluting with one hand and having his hand on the throttle quadrant with the other. I found that the parachute pack interfered with the ability of the pilot to sit correctly into the seat, so I sanded down the bottom of that pack and then added some epoxy sculpt, and while still soft, I pressed the pilot gently into the seat so that the putty would conform to the seat contour and provide for a good fit. You can find a link to the epoxy along with other products and tools used in the video description below. I removed the pilot and allowed the putty to cure for 24 hours before starting the painting process. I figured I'd start with the same process I used to paint cockpits, and that is by spraying the pilot figure a priming coat of flat black using Tamiya's flat black acrylic paint. I drilled a hole in the bottom of the figure in order to fit a toothpick in there to serve as a handle. The black serves as a foundation for shadowing effects that I'll try to add as I go. After getting the black down, I came back and sprayed a coat of Tamiya khaki on the pilot's flight suit areas. No need to be overly careful here, as all of the various body parts will be brush painted in various colors and shades using Vallejo acrylics. To build up some additional contrast between the low and high spots, I mixed up an oil wash using lamp black and raw umber and applied it pretty liberally over the entire figure. The wash runs and collects into the recessed areas and starts to create the foundation for shadowing effects. Things are looking a little messy at this point, and I'm not actually sure if in the end this particular step really added much value to the overall process. It did at least help me to define some of the smaller details. When the wash dried, I mixed up a little more Tamiya khaki and lightened it a bit with a little deck tan. This was sprayed on the main areas of the figure. I try to focus more on the higher spots and less on the low spots, like the folds in the flight suit. Here's how things looked at that point. You can kind of see how some of the contrast between the raised and low areas is developing. Now here's where all the fun starts, and also where my trial, error, and learning begins. Like I said, I'm no figure painter, so I'm kind of winging it based on the look of some of the figures I've seen online. From this point on, I use a number of Vallejo acrylic colors and shades to paint the various portions of the figure. I start first with a khaki color for the flight suit. Using a fine tip brush and a pretty thin mix of paint, I carefully paint the raised area of the pilot's pants. I avoid putting paint on those areas that are sunken or depressed in and around the folds of the pants. It's a pretty time-consuming process and requires a steady hand, but I work carefully on the left leg and then repeat the process on the right. I move on to repeat this painting process on the pilot's arms. You can see after that is complete the difference between the high and low spots and how the shadowing and highlights are starting to develop. To tone down the difference between the high and low areas, I add a little olive green to the khaki mix and then carefully paint that within each of the low areas. I add that mixture first to the areas on the pants, and then I do the same for the sleeves. Along the way, I try to blend the khaki and darker khaki mixture just a little to make the transitions between them a little less stark. Here's how things looked at this point in the process. To start to bring out a few more highlights, I added a little light beige to the khaki mixture and thinned it with water. Again, using that fine-tipped brush, I pick out the high spots on the leg and arm areas of the pilot's flight suit. With the flight suit pretty well complete, it was time to start painting some of the other features. I mixed up a little Vallejo leather brown and painted it on the pilot's gloves. I tried to avoid, where I could, some of those darker demarcation lines to keep some of the contrast in the gloves themselves. While I had that leather brown out, I also painted that color on the pilot's flight cap. I lightened up the leather brown with a little flat flesh in order to add some of the variation to the high spots. These included the square tab on the gloves, as well as the gloves piping and raised areas around the flight cap. I had to go back and fix or add some additional dark lowlights by mixing up a really thin mixture of Vallejo black gray and then applying it very carefully to the recessed area around the gloves and the cap. The life vest, or what I'm assuming is the life vest, was a greenish color, so I mixed up a custom mix and painted that on the puffed areas. I avoided, where I could, the harnesses and those dark washed recessed areas. After the base color green was down, I lightened it up with a little white and changed the tone by adding a little flat yellow. This was then applied to the higher spots on the life vest ribs. I used a darker green to paint each of the straps for the parachute harness. I realized that I had forgotten to paint the collar of the pilot's flight suit, so I had to come back and paint that. I used Vallejo flat white to paint the pilot's scarf. There were a few areas where I messed up and painted into the recesses or on the inner lining of the pilot's suit, so I had to come back and fix those areas. I moved on to start painting the face. In hindsight, this was probably something that a more experienced figure painter would have done first. Well, a good lesson learned there. I first used flat flesh to cover the face, and then darkened it with some dark flesh, and then lightened it with some white to paint some of the low and high spots and create a little variation. I used an olive green to paint the oxygen mask. In the same way as I'd done with the other areas, I darkened and lightened that mixture to paint the recessed areas where shadows would occur or the raised areas that would have reflected more light. I used that same mixture and technique to paint the areas around the goggles and the goggle straps. To paint the metal goggles, I used a little Model Masters chrome silver. I messed up and painted a little of that silver on the glass areas. I'll have to come back in and fix that later. But while I had the silver out, I painted the harness buckles as well as the buckles on the goggle straps. I used that watered-down black-gray mixture to fill in the glass areas of the goggles and also to fix the mistakes that I had made when painting the metal frames. While I had that out, I added some shadowing and contrasting demarcation lines to other areas around the flight suit, life vest, and parachute harnesses. I used a little Tamiya clear orange to create a little reflective look for the glass parts of the goggles. The kit supplies a nice set of decals for the patches on the flight suit. There are different squadron patches and such, so I just added the ones that I like best, using online references as a guide. Although the parachute pack wasn't going to be really visible after the pilot is attached to the seat, I decided to paint it in the same way as I had done with the rest of the figure. I used various shades of green, brown, yellow, white, and silver to paint all of the details on the pack. To paint the boots, I used Vallejo flat black. I mixed a little black gray up and painted the high spots of the boots in the same way as I had done with the flight suit. To seal everything in, I sprayed the whole figure with Vallejo Ultra Matte varnish. I just avoided the goggle lenses so as not to dull the shine of the clear orange. I kind of messed up the eyes a little bit by first trying to paint the white areas and then adding some brown dots for the irises. That actually looked kind of silly to me, so I just ended up painting the entire eye with a little dark brown, and to me, it made the pilot's face look a lot better and way less goofy. The kit provides an oxygen hose, but I don't really like the way that it's routed. I also want to add the pilot to the seat and install the shoulder and lap belts that I'll make in the next installment. After I get that step complete, I think I'll use a technique described in another video for making flex hoses that I have loaded up here on the channel to make that oxygen hose. Here's a look at the completed pilot installed in the cockpit sections, minus those lap and shoulder harnesses, as well as the oxygen hose. Finally, here's how things look with the cockpit and pilot installed into the airframe. While certainly far from perfect, I'm pretty happy with my rookie results. I still have a lot to learn and certainly need a lot more practice to get to where I want to be in terms of figure painting. But when you look at it as part of the entire model, I think it's at least acceptable. I hope you found this video somewhat helpful, and feel free to leave me some comments saying what you like or didn't like about it, along with any recommendations on how I can improve. Make sure to subscribe and click the notifications bell to keep up with all the latest video updates. We'll see you next time.